Mr. Buckwalter. How are you? Thank you very much for joining us for the Happy Smart City podcast. I was very honored, to meet you and learn about what you're doing and all about, the future of the built environment. And I know that a lot of people will appreciate your contributions. Thank you very much. It's an absolute honor to have you here.
It's my pleasure, Tieho. I'm glad to participate.
All right. So, getting into it, what is your current occupation and what is the future world vision at the ASCE?
Well, I'll start with ASCE, which stands for the American Society of Civil Engineers. It represents more than 150,000 members of the civil engineering profession in 177 countries. It was founded a long time ago in 1852. ASCE is the United States' oldest engineering society. ASCE stands at the forefront of a profession that plans, designs, constructs, and operates one of society's economic and social engines, the built environment, while protecting and restoring the natural environment. I am the Chief Innovation Officer at ASCE, where I oversee Future World Vision, a bold, comprehensive project to anticipate, reimagine, and prepare for future changes. In reimagining the world, civil engineers must adapt how we design, build, operate, and maintain our infrastructure systems using data-driven, in-depth scenario planning analysis. Future World Vision was designed to put engineers globally in a position to lead not just today, but 5 decades into the future.
I mean, I get chills just listening to you speak every time. This is so amazing, and I'm sure everyone can just resonate with just the idea of what the built environment would be like in the future. Especially because we're all transitioning into all of these smart cities and the connected environments and all these futuristic designs. It's unfathomable. And the next one is, how does your profession contribute to the economies of cities?
Well, civil engineers are the planners, designers, constructors, and even operators of the built environment, which is a key part of society's economic and social engine. The built environment, if done properly, enables city economies. If not done right, or if left neglected, hinders city economies. If, for example, the transportation system is efficient and affordable, urban economies thrive. If water availability and quality is high, urban economies run well and are equitable. If energy and communication systems are robust at the granular level of individual buildings and living or working quarters, urban economies are healthy. And I could go on and on. Civil engineers are also the stewards of the natural environment and its resources, so we shouldn't neglect that, as well as the innovators and integrators of ideas and technology across the public, private, and academic sectors. So we believe engineering makes a big difference in the contribution to the economies of cities.
That is so amazing. And I'd like to reiterate two things that you mentioned: equitable cities and also the right stewardship of the natural environment. I know you talked a lot about that as well. in our previous interactions. But I think that is so important for a lot of developing regions that have to deal with, population explosions and, uh, huge bulges in their youth demographics, because they're going to have to play such a very careful balance on how their critical infrastructure is rolled out and the built environment. I mean, the pollution that comes from that is just it's unbelievable. But when done right, it could be just as positive. So that is really really critical. Um, and then the next one is, what is the importance of metrology and standards in civil engineering and the broader built environment?
Well, metrology, by definition, requires standards. To be very simplistic, someone has to define definitively and establish the length of a meter before you can compare the length of any object to that objective standard. You can't measure something if there's no standard to compare it to. Civil engineering standards, therefore, provide the technical guidelines for creating an acceptable level of safety, reliability, productivity, and efficiency in the broader built environment. Now, in the United States, many of ASCE's standards are referenced by building codes and adopted by federal, state, and local jurisdictions. But they are also used and provide guidance for design projects around the world. And at the very grassroots level, by applying those standards, infrastructure owners can help to ensure that their assets are consistent, compatible, safe, and effective based on the best known data and science that we have. So ASCE takes a prominent role in the world in establishing those standards by which we will measure the health, the effectiveness, the safety of our built environment, and the welfare of those of us who live and transport in it.
Now, one follow-up question comes to mind, if I may. Are there any inefficiencies that come? I know you mentioned that you've got 100,000, 150,000 people around the world, and I'm just so curious about the different measuring systems. What inefficiencies are there, or at least how do you reconcile the different measuring systems?
Well, we reconcile the measurements by simply partnering with the civil engineering societies in those respective countries. So while we may create a standard, for instance, in the US, we will work hand in hand with the very large British ICE, which is the sister organization in London, and they will establish similar standards that are used there. Between those two societies, the rest of the societies of the world generally pattern and convert, the measurements, the standards by which we will measure the health of our infrastructure pretty much around the world.
Great, great, great. So, how has COVID-19 affected the built environment, and to what extent do you see emerging for your industry in a post-COVID global economy?
Well, I would say, obviously, many design and build projects around the world were postponed during the COVID crisis. However, many are now restarting. Post COVID, there's an opportunity not just to reverse the economic downturn by our infrastructure investments, but by investing in sustainable infrastructure that will more fully bring us into the 21st century and set us up for success in the decades to come. That's what we mean when we at ASCE use the phrase, we need to build back better. Also, life will permanently change to some extent. I'll use two examples. As a larger percentage of the population continues to work from home, has goods delivered to their doorstep, connects virtually, and makes permanent some of these recent behavioral changes, our infrastructure will need to change to respond to that. Secondly, our entire infrastructure ecosystem will now need to accommodate COVID related prophylactic measures. I'll use buildings as an example. We will need to design healthier air exchange of indoor air, the use of ultraviolet light for cleansing the air, and less dense space planning among the tenants of a building. That's very different from the nearly exclusive focus on energy and cost efficiency, which has driven building design for the last 50 years. So, planners will need to account for these massive sociological and economical changes and rebuild our infrastructure to accommodate both of these shifts.
This is a very interesting time. I mean, everything that you mentioned is obviously very spot on. And everywhere you go, investors are talking about investing in warehousing because of these new dynamics that you're mentioning. But I think this is also a very interesting time in financial and economic history because technically speaking, this is a recession. And I'm just so stunned about how the demand of real estate is so low because very often when the economy goes into recession, obviously real estate has low occupancy, the anchor tenants are out, and so the valuations are, price of a hot dog. But no one's really looking into traditional real estate for, for commercial purposes. Not a lot of people are talking about shopping malls. I've heard people say no, to those types of transactions, even though the valuations are so low. And all of this stuff that has to deal with, the convenience and the social distancing is really taking precedence. I can agree 100% with that. Now, the next one is how does data contribute to built environment? And how do you predict the widespread adoption of IoT sensor networks and edge computing? How do you see those contributing to the built environment?
Um, I think there's a huge contribution here. We've already begun to see the use of data in the design and construction process. That's a phenomena that's well on its way. But in the future, we're also going to see emerging technology that is incorporated into our infrastructure that can be used to enhance human productivity and quality of life. If you will, the merging of the physical and the digital. However, as we often talk about it, collected data should be used in an appropriate manner, with private sector and government entities working together to ensure personal privacy and safety. Future plans and programs should lead to the development and operation of an integrated, merged physical and digital infrastructure system that facilitates the efficient and economically beneficial housing and movement of people, goods, and ideas. It's a huge challenge. There's so much opportunity for benefit with the widespread adoption of IoT, but there's a huge opportunity to get it wrong. So this one's going to need careful attention.
That reminds me of again some of the the issues that we discussed offline, you know, I just can't wrap my head around um, the 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 population growth curve and what that means for habitable land. Because as you know, cities try to accommodate more people at faster rates, I'm just so worried about the morphology of the cities. And how do we decide to scale the cities? You know, do we have urban regions that provide everything, or do we have specialized regions? You know, what can you say about that?
So I take, I'm a strategic planner at heart. So I take a very long-term perspective. So let's just kind of talk about what's emerging here. And this relates back to your comment that talked about the odd nature of the lack of market movement in commercial real estate. Uh, I'll draw a correlation. So just bear with me. I'm kind of go off script here, and I just want to think about this.
Please, please do.
The the I remember I worked in national security issues 10, 15 years ago in countries around the world, right after the 9/11 event in the United States. And I can remember everyone saying, oh, everyone will move out of the cities. Okay. Nobody's going to buy commercial real estate. Who wants to be in the city? It's too dangerous. Another event could happen. Within 5 years, the city retail market was booming. So I think as we come out of COVID, for example, as an investor, there's two perspectives. What's the near term effect? Where, yes, we still have people who are going to adopt virtual working. And so the need to come into a city is different than it was before. However, the human DNA is both rational, emotional, and social. And the social need to be with other people is not going to go away. And over the long term, community effect is required. It's just part of human nature. And so I think we should think about in the long term that basic need that defines what quality of life is for the mix of things people want in their built environment and how they want to live, work, and transport. And here's the real challenge to think about that even in the midst of, let's say, the fourth industrial revolution, where we have IoT, we have automation, we have autonomy, we have new materials, we have unbelievable changes coming our way that will enable a new mix of those who want to be in cities, who want to be in cities infrequently, those who want to be close enough, but still a more rural environment, which, by the way, with virtual work or in 40 years from now with high speed transport, you know, you could be much more distant from an urban city with virtual and high speed transport than you ever imagined today. So we have to be bold enough to envision what those new technologies and demographic changes that you described are going to cause the built environment to be that define the most optimum quality of life that we desire. Here's the challenge. Built environment is a long-term asset. So if we don't think about it, we either create the optimum built asset for today that is not optimum in 20, 30, 40, or 50 years, but yet it has a 100-year life cycle. Or worse yet, we create great assets now that, if not used or become unusable or non-preferred in the future, well, we're just good at what humanity's always been good at, which is creating the slums of tomorrow. Nobody wants to do that. So this requires us to think further down the road than we've ever thought before. And the reason is there's more change coming our way than we've seen in hundreds of years. And so engineers, as the master designers and builders of the built environment, have a really big challenge in front of them. We have to become better at anticipating the outcomes of our designs for physical infrastructure. In other words, what's the resulting societal benefit? What's the resulting quality of life before we start designing and building it? That's the huge change that I think all of science, engineering, technologies, math, social sciences need to adjust in order for us to create, to your very point, the preferred smart cities of the future, the happy smart cities of the future. It's going to be a challenge. We cannot continue to do the built environment the way it's been done for hundreds of years. We are at an inflection point. I'm absolutely convinced of it.
So I'll first take my hat off to the U.S. because I mean, your nation has, the longest road network, and the potential for that as a platform is just phenomenal. But I'm just wondering about other regions that don't have the right, base platforms, and maybe they make some rash decisions. I mean, what advice could you give, and what would they have to prioritize on for such a dynamic, you know, time in recorded history?
My advice would come in two forms. Um, and this marries to the smart city conversation we're having. I mean, look at the African continent now, where on the communications infrastructure side, that that continent has leapt ahead, has leapfrogged in, for instance, social media and mobile telecommunications, the built infrastructure of communications in some other countries. Um, we're still struggling with some other basic built environment fundamentals in water and energy and other things, but in communications, there's been huge progress. And the fact that you didn't have built infrastructure at scale actually will allow, as it has there, some infrastructure to leapfrog and accommodate the future better. So my first point is everybody should take this as an opportunity not to just worry because some of the structure is not in place, but to figure out how to use that to leapfrog to the better future in built environment that's difficult to do in the United States when you have already this baked in investment in the existing infrastructure. So, my first point is don't view it as just a negative.
Hmm.
Look at it as a potential opportunity. The
Yeah.
second point I will make is as you look at the future and what you need, I keep coming back to this every time I look at the built environment over the next 50 years. Two themes just constantly emerge and should be at the forefront of our thinking. One is everything will be digital. That's a movement that you can't stop. The efficiencies of digital, the cost effectiveness, the productivity, it's a wave that will never stop, despite some concerns with it. Obviously, it brings with it a cybersecurity fear, for instance. But everything we plan should be thought of as as what does the digital world look like for all communities, all cities. If we don't do that, we will have missed a huge opportunity, because the world's not going to stop it from happening. It just won't happen in an optimum fashion if we don't plan it properly. The second thing that overwhelmingly comes back to me is the principles of circular economies. For the built environment, to me, that comes down to sustainability, making sure they're resilient, making sure there's social equity. Um, Again, I mean, let's face it, Western civilization for 1,000 years has been able to grow without paying proper concern to that. But we all now know that those issues, if not attended to, will overwhelm us. And so, if we pay close attention to this emerging of the digital world with the whole physical world around us, and always think in terms of circular economy, sustainability, resilience, equity, um, we will do great things. And if we don't pay attention to those things, very suboptimum results will occur. That's just I can't I always come back to those two things.
I'll agree again. I'll agree again on this one because if you look at the demographic trajectories and in Japan, most of the mature economies, the EU, Japan, and the US and North America, there's this crunching of the youth demographic, and people are living longer, which is phenomenal. And the more educated people get in these developed economies, educated people just don't want to have children. That's just the average reality, And so here are baby boomers leaving behind these mountains and mountains of money, behind to people who won't have that many children and will be living longer. But again, there's these regions like India, Africa, and Latin America, where people are a lot younger, and I'm just always so curious about that type of economic dynamic. I mean, because young people again are just so creative, and everyone wants to do their own thing. They don't want to work in traditional economic settings. I think that play also is just really interesting to me to see where the the okay, it's obvious where the engines of growth will come from. They'll come from the youth, but the value chains, you know, going up. I mean, it's just these are just interesting times. That was a bit of a tangent there, but it came to mind. Um,
Yep.
this question here, this one it's a big one for me personally, um, in context to this interview. And this one is: to what extent are APIs and expert systems interoperability providing ease of work and agile workflows in the built environment?
Well, over the last few decades, computer software has obviously helped improve the built environment. A new era of smart and sustainable urban systems is enabling transformative change in the way urban communities are interacting among themselves and with the built environment to become more sustainable and resilient to meet demands of the growing urban population. But interoperability has been shown to be a major barrier for the seamless transfer of information between what I would call the heterogeneous landscape of the Internet of Things and smart city functions. Expert systems have been developing, but they are traditionally planned and designed for the needs of each city department, for example. So they optimize each city function, but often do not create optimization at the macro level. Agile workflows, therefore, often stop at departmental walls and do not cross the divide into interrelated city system wide improvement. We still have a long way to go, and our existing city frameworks, our existing city governance systems need to be re examined to ensure we don't discard the good reasons they were created that way, but to ensure what I would call a holistic view of the city and better enable smart and sustainable urban systems in the future. If we're going to provide the best city environment for our systems, we have to start becoming system thinkers. And that's true for the engineers who design and build it. And it's true for the government officials who have to go find ways to fund it and legislate it. We have to stop thinking in silos. It's a hard thing to do, but in my mind, we have wonderful expert systems, but the interoperability across functions is still lacking to a great extent.
I will agree with that because I know there's to an extent some data types and files can be shared across different built environment systems. But if you look at environments like your Microsofts and enterprise systems in general, there's a high level of interoperability. But when it comes to the MATLabs and the SolidWorks and the ANSYS and other sort of back office expert software, it's I to my knowledge, I really haven't seen that much ease of information sharing across all of those platforms. Would you say that is true?
I would say that's absolutely true.
Mm,
Different functions, it goes back to a basic governance issue. In civil society, our governance structures are usually managed by functions, are budgeted by functions, and we just haven't had the ability to think through how to create agile workflows between functions. It's just, and so, and in fact, if you budget it by function, of course the leaders and the engineers of that city function are going to contract someone to do what that function or that department needs. It's a natural thing. This is not something where somebody's done something wrong. It's part of the change of the whole governance structure that we have to think through. And if we're thinking about the future where sciences are merging, disciplines are merging, uh, again, I'm back to the fourth industrial revolution. That's the nexus of all these things that makes this integrated governance that much more important. Otherwise, we simply won't plan, budget, or design the expert systems to be interoperable. It's nobody's fault. It's just that at the very top leadership level, we have to think through that governance issue.
mm. And I'll just add one last point to this because the more research that I do into software and just managing complexity, I always come across the issue of ontologies and taxonomies, and it almost seems like there's this data um, data design principle that's just so universal across the different applications. And people in finance today, I mean, I could talk about the biggest finance associations, and they're still trying to figure out how to define the financial professional of the future because they're looking more and more like a software engineer. you know
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
just like, yeah, they're just like a software engineer with a finance encyclopedia. And there's another shocking, observation that I made, or at least, I mean, this public knowledge, when the previous CEO of Goldman Sachs left, he declared the company a fintech. He said,
Yeah.
no, this company is not a bank, it's a fintech. And that was also, I mean, it wasn't a publicity stunt because in 2016, then CTO moved into being chief financial officer, meaning that, all of the accounting and all of the financial management was becoming less and less important, because what was starting to happen is that was being delegated to what they call the reg tech, the regulation technology. And you can just, you know, chuck in those accounting rules into those systems. And really, I mean, they hardly change. What you really have to focus on is the applications and how you keep innovating, with the applications and serving the market. And a lot of the old professions are just becoming so stagnant, and data and technology is just taking over.
Right. Well, Tieho, I'll take it one step further. Those who work in data, network systems, start to think in common across whatever function you're working in. So think about this departmental difference or industry difference. In the past, it was like everybody spoke a different language, let alone having a different taxonomy. A financial person compared to a civic leader, compared to an engineer, compared to an insurer, all were talking a different language and a different taxonomy. But for a data person, it doesn't matter. This is an opportunity to reconstruct those for the flow of data, which is what's going to be how we do it in the future. And this is a chance to change that. And I think that's why the emergence of the digital infrastructure, if we do it right, is a chance to fix some of those inherent problems that we've always had.
All right. Now, I know we've touched a bit on this one, but it's still very important to talk about it and address it, in isolation. So this next question says, what advice would you give to governments and investors with large infrastructure sustainability mandates?
Well, first, if I was speaking to a government person, I would recommend that they don't think of mandates as the classic burden that's been imposed upon you. Sustainable infrastructure is the opportunity to promote more effective and efficient use of financial resources, improved pollution prevention, reduced carbon emissions, reduced use of materials can all result in financial and economic benefits. So, this again is a chance to look at all challenges as an upside as opposed to a financial challenge. And because there's a lot more private money investment that's out there, been sitting on the sidelines for many, many years, that is very socially conscious. As a result, there's an increasing amount of environmental sustainability project financing that's now available. So that's one thing that I would suggest, where governments can get with investors and figure that out. And again, I know this is a challenge because as the world changes, we always hear people talk about the environmental benefit, and then I hear other people talk about job losses, and on it goes, and we create these camps of division. But building sustainable infrastructure supports what I would call a net positive result of economic improvement and job creation. Now, doesn't mean that some jobs go away. It means others are created.
Yes.
It doesn't change the fact that some economic models go away, but others come and take its place. So there is a net positive result in economy and job creation if we build sustainable infrastructure. And it can also now emphasize very much what people have recognized as the viability of the purchase of local goods and services as part of that. So, in my mind, that's the advice I would give. This is an opportunity for financial benefit, for job benefit. But again, you don't ignore the downsides, you manage them along with the huge upsides, and everybody can be a winner.
Yes, yes, yes. I think the biggest one there, I mean, like we're saying, and we agree on this, that people do have, they have reasons to panic. But, the truth of the matter is, let's not cling to the horse carriage when we have the steam locomotive.
Right.
But I guess then the biggest question is, how do we transition and how do we manage the transmissions into those different phases? I think is certainly the biggest one.
Exactly. And this is where some creativity between the investor community and the government leadership community can go a long way. So if you can create the obvious financial benefit and return to the investors, but include in that some government regulated, incented
Hmm.
return to
Yeah,
those who are
yeah,
displaced, either geographically or in their jobs,
yeah,
then we can manage our way through it. This is the moment to do it because
yeah,
there is going to be a financial upside. So this is the perfectly appropriate place where government can be creative so that as we ride the wave of the financial investment, we can take care of those who would have been on the losing side of the transformation while still allowing the investment community to get very excellent returns. I'm convinced the opportunity's there. We just have to be a little more creative than we were in the past.
yeah. And you would know that very well with the civil engineering, because I mean there's all these huge projects and people need to be reaccommodated, and certainly those the incentives, and to make sure that people are better off than they were when they're displaced is certainly a big one. So the final question is, what elements of smart cities should local governments focus on to allow for happier and more fulfilling cities?
Well, I would let me let me preface my answer with this comment. Smart cities focus on happiness by maximizing the well-being of their citizens and the quality of life of every individual. Therefore, government leaders, before they start picking and choosing what element to focus on, should first focus on the outcomes or the end states that are desired first, and then start planning for the elements of smart cities that create a path toward those outcomes. It's a big theme of mine. Look at the outcomes first before you jump in. Now, for smart cities, it's easy to do that. Some of these things are really exciting. Invest again in the smart city elements that consciously drive toward the outcomes you want, not just what you could do. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. Now, it turns out that there is no small set of smart city elements that are the focus. Every aspect of your life, healthcare, the environment, mobility,
Mm,
infrastructure, connectivity, creature comforts, and governance are aided by the utilization of smart city functions and maximizing efficiency. They're all done that. So that's why I say look at the holistic picture and the outcomes first. For
mm,
example, traffic efficiency, cleaner air, and mobility are all aided by the collection of data and by acting on these data collection activities. And I can't help but also say smart technology can also promote equity in urban areas. And I'll wrap up with just an example because it's fresh on my mind. ASCE recently designated a free autonomous shuttle program in Columbus, Ohio, in the United States as one of its infrastructure game changers. Now, the autonomous shuttle is really cool. It's beneficial for the environment, but it also connects residents to important resources, including a major transit hub. Projects such as this have been popping up around the country and serve as a first mile / last mile solution for those who previously lacked direct access to public transit centers. It's just a small example, but it's another example where the right smart city elements can create efficiency, environmental impact, financial benefit, and equity. And we won't think of all those unless we look at the quality of life element first for every segment of the society that's going to live in that geographic area. And when we do that, then it becomes obvious which portions of the new technology get us to those end objectives. And that's just one example. But I just keep encouraging people, again, don't just do smart cities because you can. Do the right elements of smart cities because it achieves the societal benefit and quality of life that you desire for your city.
I wish, hearing you speak, I wish all the ESG investors could just listen to you speak. Um, I really do hope that a lot of investors can take this to heart, and with the pension funds and sovereigns, I think they should definitely be leading the wave, not just with the government incentives, but because they have extra long-term capital allocation mandates, they need to lead and create that base platform that incentivizes, the smaller institutions like private equity and venture capital to behave more responsibly. But they are doing that. It's just an issue of sometimes competition, pushes people to get a quick buck, and I think we'll get there. I think the fact that there's so much data and there's so much sources for insights, human beings will keep making better decisions, and I really do believe that.
It's a great point, Tieho. Most countries of the world have not found the best balance of what I'll call public funding and private funding for the built environment, because both have its place. If we don't design some infrastructure with the whole gamut of private funding that you just described, we miss the opportunity to take a long-term perspective, build into the whole life cycle assessment, the ability to keep that thing maintained, and all of that. On the other hand, some elements of infrastructure don't produce the return private investors want. So that's where public funding is perfectly appropriate. We should stop depending on public funding for everything,
Yeah.
and we should not depend on private funding for everything. We should find the right mix of that, and it should be balanced based upon the appropriateness of the nature of the return and societal benefit of each kind of infrastructure element. As always, the answer is never simple. It's complex, but
Mm.
we're up for it if we put our mind to it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, Jerry, this has been an absolute treat. This has been another good one for me, and I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity. And it's a learning experience as well, not just for the listeners, but for myself. So this is highly appreciated. Thank you so much.
Tieho, it was my pleasure.